And we're back looking at Islamic art. And I want to introduce you to this guy, Roger II, who was the king of Sicily, crowned that in 1130. And I just want you to take a gander at this image where it's none other than Jesus laying that crown on his head. So in this mosaic, we are, I believe, meant to assume that Roger has the blessing of Christ and by extension, Christ Father God in assuming the role of king. So, not pictured here, but actually pictured here is a mantle created for that actual crowning. Now, that wasn't shown in the mosaic, but what we're looking at is a large piece of silk sewn with thousands and thousands of pearls, with gold thread, with sapphires, and a mantle. I'm going to show you a photograph of a mantle in a foot as used by a king. This is not obviously Roger, but to give you the sense that it kind of hangs over typically a monarch and is clasped. So why am I bringing this up? Because when this was made in the 1100s, it was made by Muslim craftspeople and artists who no doubt learned the craft of silk making because of the Silk Road, because remember, silk derives or originates in China. And but it's not merely that, it's the motifs used here and an inscription along the hem, the curved hem, that indicate that these were Muslims that made this mantle for a Christian king. So, moving on to some details. So, along, if you will, the kind of axis of the mantle is what is described as the tree of life. Here's the top of the tree, and right there at the top edge, you see the two clasps that would have been used to secure the mantle on the shoulders of Roger. So we have our tree of life, and on either side of the tree of life are lions subduing, presumably ultimately killing, a couple of camels. So the lions, you see their heads and their little striped bodies. I mean, come on, they're not exactly depicted from life, but that's okay. So you see the lion heads, you see the manes, you see their striped bodies, and you see the kind of hapless camels that are kind of hanging out under them. Here's that detail again. And so lions and camels are obviously not animals that were indigenous to Europe. And so, like the silk that comprises this mantle, the motifs themselves are clearly based on motifs found in other objects, animal motifs like camels, like lions, and have been again incorporated by Muslim artists into this clothing that was going to be draped on the shoulders of Roger on his most important day. So how do we know it was for Roger? How do we know when it was made? Here, in the hem of the garment, in the border, is inscribed in Arabic the year, but not 1130, but rather the year in the Islamic calendar, which is based on Muhammad and his encounter with the angel Gabriel. And so we have then very clearly stated in the border of the garment the year and the occasion for the garment, and that should look kind of familiar to you in that calligraphy in Arabic is in that Kufic style with the very, very strong vertical and horizontal forms that we saw in our dish in the last video. Similarly, different material, but another example of this kind of permeability between Islam and Europe, because again, certainly in present day media, one would imagine that Muslims and Islam are this other, capital O, when we found out last week that Allah is just the Arabic word for God. Muslim God, the God that Muslims believe in, is the same God of the Jews and Christians. So, what is known as the Abrahamic God. So, these objects I'm showing you are also kind of reinforcing this notion of permeability, not sort of separation. So, now I want to show you a basin that we know was made in the 1300s by Muhammad al-Zain. And the basin is a very sizable, wide, let me say this, let me try again. It's a sizable vessel with a very wide, open top that was designed to hold water and was likely sat on a banquet table. So we know this because that was a common practice to have these basins of water. And if you were hosting a big shindig, you would have these on your table for your guests to wash their hands prior to eating. Now, you'll notice probably immediately this particular basin is covered in both human figures and animal figures. That tells us a couple of things. That statement, Muslims don't put figures in their art, is not true. They do. They simply don't put those kind of objects in sacred space. And so we know then, with the inclusion of these figures and animals, that this object was intended for use in a domestic space, most likely a palace. And the other thing this tells us is we're seeing kind of hunting motifs that we've seen in our class since very early on, ancient Near East. We saw those Assyrian kings fighting off lions. If you look at our little detail here, I think you can see our main figure on horseback there has actually not a lion, but a little bear that he seems to be killing. Along the bottom that the red arrow is pointing out, we've got kind of kitty-like big cat figures. We have a camel just beyond the red arrow. Back here at the top of the basin, you'll see more kind of running creatures. Again, big cats and the like. And these same motifs are actually inside the vessel itself. So this, again, designed as it was for the table of most likely some kind of member of the elite or a Muslim king, was so beautifully wrought in hammered brass and in silver that an object like this, there was no analog being made in Europe at this same time in the 1300s. European craftsmen just didn't have these skills. And the reason I'm pointing that out, and I just want to show you here how exquisite this thing is when you get up close and personal. There is no bit of surface that isn't highly decorated. And if you look to the left of our kind of main dude on a horse, you'll see, look, there's like the red arrows pointing out a little duck or bird-like figure. The kind of brass is the wing, and if you look up from that, you'll see a little head and a beak. So this kind of skill, again, specific to Muslim craftspeople working, in this case, in areas around Egypt and Syria and further east. So the extraordinary thing about this is, because of those trade routes that we come to know as the Silk Road, this made its way into Europe and blew everyone away, and was thought to be so extraordinary that it actually became used to baptize future kings of France. We call that a baptistry. So a baptistry can either be a building you baptize people in, or it can be the actual vessel holding holy water for baptism. And as a result, it went from being called the Basin of Muhammad al-Zain to the baptistry of Saint Louis, because one of the kings of France, Louis, became Saint Louis later. So here again, as with the mantle, that extraordinary robe, that robe of silk and jewels, we see a kind of mutual appreciation of the workmanship that goes into these objects, so much so that, Roger II wants Muslim craftspeople artists to make his mantle. And this object, which was made for, a Muslim king, was so treasured, despite the fact it has Arabic inscriptions on it, the fact that it was made for the use and enjoyment of Muslims. Christian French kings later on in the Gothic period were like, no, we got to have this thing. Okay, folks, that's it for now. Stay tuned for more. Bye.